My name is Ori Soltes, as you know, because you wouldn't be here if you hadn't read the thing that said that I was going to be here talking about this book. It's actually the second book that I have written on Fethullah Gulen and his thinking. The first, I can't remember when, maybe 10 years ago or so, and the angle of that book was particularly with respect to the way his thinking is influenced by and reflects the kind of mystical thought that you get, in particular, in someone like Rumi, the 13th century, Azerbaijani, Persian, Turkish mystic. Everyone claims him. But we all know that he wrote in English, and they just translated his stuff into those other languages. And I've read it all in the original English, I want you to know. So I'm very good at that. But that work I wrote without ever having met Fethullah Gulen. So it was based entirely on two things. A now good friend of mine, Emre Celik, who at the time was the head of the Rumi Forum, had organized a number of sessions at Georgetown. There was kind of a mini Rumi Forum there for about 2 years. Jews, Christians, Muslims, we were talking about different subjects. So it was kind of a assigned subject, and I actually had a student who was involved with them. I was not. And they wanted someone who could talk about death, the soul, and the afterlife. In the Jewish tradition, he said, oh, I know who can do that. So that was me. And it ended up going on because there was a lot to say. And in the course of things, Emre said, you know, I had a book that had just come out on mysticism, on Jewish, Christian, and Muslim mysticism, and one that had come out a bit earlier on symbols in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim art. And Emre said, why don't we do a book program for both those books in Rumi Forum's offices, which they did. And sometime thereafter he said, would you ever think about writing something about Gulen from the angle of your interest, say mysticism? And I said, well, give me some time to think about it, because frankly I didn't know much about him or about the movement. I had one colleague in the area of Georgetown where I teach who ran the no longer extant, the now defunct Turkish Studies program. It's no longer extant because the support from the Turkish government stopped. But he was very much what we'd call a Kemalist, someone who believes that the only proper direction for Turkey is to be absolutely hardcore secular, and therefore saw Gulen as someone, as many from that side of the fence have seen him, as a threat, because his perspective is that one of the ways in which Turkey seemed to have lost its way, and this he saw by way of the youth, to use that familiar turn of phrase, of the 60s and 70s of Turkey, was that they were completely disconnected from any kind of spiritual identity. In this case, obviously the vast majority of them Muslim. So his perspective was that Turkey needed to rethink itself with respect in particular to its Muslim roots. Not to the exclusion of non-Muslims, but with a rethinking about that. And so needless to say, there ended up being two groups who were either offended or felt threatened by Gulen as time went on. One was the secularists, and the other were the Islamists, because his vision of Islam was first of all not political but civil and civic, and second of all his ambitions, particularly as they evolved over time, grew even more to be affirming of interfaith, intercultural, international, interethnic conversation, and not, he realized, the world can't be improved if I think of it only from the perspective of Turkey, or only of perspective of Islam, or only perspective of Sunni Islam, or Alevi Islam, or whatever other subsets you want to make your particular circle. That if we're not all in it, then in the end, all of us suffer from not having all of us in it. And that really became where he evolved to rather quickly in his own thinking. So I knew nothing about this. All I knew was that my colleagues said, oh, he's a dangerous man, which I found interesting. I found nothing dangerous in the conversations that we were having over those evenings at Georgetown. And I said to Emre, I said, well, let me read first. And it took me about a year. I read a lot of stuff, everything I could, in the original English, of course, none of it in the Turkish translations. And less then was available than now in English, by the way. But I felt increasingly comfortable with writing with conviction about his thinking and how it related to the kind of individual that Rumi is renowned for having been. He's two things. He is a dyed-in-the-wool Muslim, and he's a universalist. So as much as he talks about his Muslim identity, he is constantly letting out lines like, you know, I walk into the synagogue, I walk into a church, I walk into a mosque, I see one altar, that kind of a thing. And he's not alone in that. His predecessor in that kind of thinking, in the Sufi side of things, is Ibn Arabi, is even more articulate in that kind of a way. So that was that. But I had never met Gulen. I met him probably about a year after I wrote the book. And you know when you meet someone whom you have admired from a distance, you know, some kind of star, a movie star, a sports star, that kind of a thing. And then you meet that individual and you are so underwhelmed. You are so, oh my God, you know, this person is not at all the kind of person I thought because of what I saw from a distance. With Gulen, it was exactly the opposite. There was an immediate sense of electricity, really, for the kind of personality that he has. I've known many falsely humble people in my life. His humility is so profoundly there. It's so real. His concern for others rather than for himself. All the things that those who admire him say he is, only more than they say. And I was quite moved by meeting him. And I thought, wow, am I glad I wrote that book? Anyway, time passes. And we get to July of 2016. You're all too young to remember that far away. But it's, you were all little kids. And all of a sudden there was all this news about this failed coup that was taking place in Istanbul. And I should point out in passing that over the course of the time between the end of the 90s, which is when Gulen moved here for health reasons, and he had a relationship, it was never a friendship, but it was a very cordial relationship with Mr. Erdogan, because he felt that Erdogan was leading Turkey in the right direction. He saw in Erdogan the kind of leader, as Erdogan presented himself, who understood the importance of the interface between a Muslim identity and democracy, a democratic political identity. And either power corrupts and Erdogan changed, or Erdogan was very successful over the course of time, having concealed what his true ambitions were. Because the last comment that I know he made about democracy was, it's like a train. The time comes and you've got to get off. And for him, that time was coming before 2016, but 2016 was an important point of departure for Turkey and its relationship with democracy. And everything about the coup that I learned, directly, indirectly, what I heard, what I read, what I could see by way of camera, contradicted the notion that this was a failed coup. Because, you know, if there's one thing that Turks know, aside from food, of course, is how to make coups. If you're familiar with Turkish history in the last 60 years, it's like every 10 years there's a coup, of one sort or another. You don't do it during rush hour, you don't do it, you know, in the middle of the day, you do it in the middle of the night when no one's around. You make sure that you first round up the people you have to get and don't wait for them to figure out a way to show up after you haven't rounded them up and mess it up. Everything about it was wrong, including Erdogan's reported comments that were overheard by the Brits saying, I don't care what happens, just make sure that the Hizmet, that the Gulen people get blamed. I mean, everything about it smacked to me not of a failed coup, but of a fake coup, of a coup that he had initiated so as to give him the culminating opportunity to do what he had been in the process of doing over the previous couple of years, which was slowly subverting the three branches that, like the United States, Turkey has of its government. He was subverting the judicial, he was subverting the legislative, and ultimately, of course, he subverted the executive branch. He is ruler for life by having bothered to go to the formality of making a change to the Constitution, which is almost funny, but okay. That's what Augustus Caesar did way back when. It's still a Roman Republic. I'm just the first among equals. I'm not the emperor, but he's the emperor. Erdogan is not the emperor, but he's the emperor, or should I say caliph. In any case, so I was reminded of what I'm well aware of because of things that I otherwise study, that happened in 1933 when the Reichstag was burned by the National Socialist Party in Germany, those whom we more popularly call the Nazis, and they managed to pin it effectively on the communists. And that gave them the chance to round up all the communists, who at that point was the key political party in opposition to the Nazi Party. And it became then a straight shoot to everything else that followed in the next 12 years after the burning of the Reichstag. So I saw what had happened in Istanbul in July of 2016 as that kind of an affair. A false, not a fake, a false and a fake, not a failed coup. One that had been initiated by Erdogan himself to position him to finalize what he had been in the process of doing and continue to do over the next year with respect to apprehending all the reins of power and using as his scapegoat Hizmet, the followers, those inspired by Fethullah Gulen. Mind you, those who have been arrested, tortured, and or executed in Turkey are not limited to Hizmet people. It's anyone who opposes him. But it's very easy to put that label. If you come into someone's house and they just happen to have a book by Gulen in their library, among 10,000 books, they have one by Gulen, that's sufficient evidence, and you're gone. You're probably aware of the fact that Turkey has more people per capita, more journalists for sure, in this National Press Club, more journalists in prison than any country on the planet, including China, even including the United States. So anyway, I was, needless to say, disturbed by that, and that's when the idea percolated in my head to write a book that part of the point and purpose of which would be to give the lie to what was being spewed from the only Turkish source available, which was an Erdogan initiated source. This was more confirmed for me because my best friend who lives out in Cleveland, and whom I visit every summer, later, I don't remember if it was, I think it was the next summer, showed me a copy of New Yorker magazine, right? This is a very fine magazine, we all know this. It's highly regarded, its journalists are top-notch. Here we are again, National Press Club, top-notch journalists. There was an article about Gulen, and he said, I know you're very involved with him. Tell me what you think, because it's not a very positive article. Well, it took me months to get around to it. I finally did. And it was like, I was blown away. It's not just that it was an excoriating article of Fethullah Gulen, but the way in which it was gave very strong evidence that he had one source, which was whatever source it, or one array of sources, whatever sources were provided by the Erdogan machine. He had not done his research, he had not done his homework, he had not checked anything but what he got from the Turks themselves, and was apparently too stupid to realize, given the situation of Turkey, which as a journalist you should know something about, that you can't rely on that single source. Fair to take it as one of your sources, but not your only source. So that sort of confirmed me in this idea that I've got to write this kind of a book. So it was Emrah again who had the suggestion. He said, well, why don't you do something, because there are biographies of Fethullah Gulen. A very fine one came out about, it feels like yesterday, it's probably 3 years ago, John Paul's biography, right? And his is not the only one, but it's among the more excellent and more recent ones. Why don't you interview people who are involved at various levels with him? And I thought, that's a great idea. So in the end, I did that. I interviewed about 80 people, ranging from his personal physician, who's known him since elementary school, to people like myself, who are not Turkish, who are not Muslim, but are engaged or involved in some way with this organization, this movement, this idea, that would be a better word, this idea of Hizmet, which for those of you who are not aware is simply the Turkish word for service. And so it's all about that. By the way, parenthesis, the first time I had accepted a paper and spoke at a conference that was sponsored by the Hizmet people, they were still referring to it as the Gulen movement. And I remember saying from the audience in response to someone else's paper, two things. I said, you probably, calling it the Gulen movement to American ears, it sounds like a cult. And gradually that's changed. because if there's anyone who doesn't want this to be a cult, it's Fethullah Gulen himself. And now I'm not reporting what others have said. I can tell you, based on my several conversations with him, that's about the last thing that he wants, because that's not what he's about. So Hizmet is a much more effective comment about what it is. The other thing at the time that I said was the word that is being used, tolerance, is also, it's too weak a word. Because when I think of religious tolerance, I think when most people do, it's this: I tolerate you. I'm up here, you're down there. And someone said, no, but the Turkish word hoşgörü, which is being translated as tolerance, is a bad translation. Hoşgörü really means, to see things through someone else's eyes. And that's why that first book that the subtitle was Embracing the World, because that's really what it's about. It's not about tolerating, it's about embracing the differences of others and figuring out how we have to figure it out together, all of us, different as we are, so that we can all function ultimately more effectively and more, well, perfectly, to help create a perfect world, which is quite a task. So I interviewed about 80 people, and the structure of the book essentially is threefold. I do offer, of course, a brief discussion of him biographically, but in a way different from what I did otherwise or what John Paul did. I was much more dependent on a book by a Turkish writer, as a matter of fact, a journalist, Faruk Mercan, who had gone into great research with respect to Fethullah Gulen's family, his background, and you read this, and you're not really surprised when he turns out to be exactly the opposite of what Mr. Erdogan is, or the kind of person that Erdogan would like you to believe that he is, because he comes from a genuinely, almost ridiculously pious background. And there's a difference between being pious and being pretentious about your piety. And I'm eager for that to be understood, just because I'm eager for that to be understood, but also because, as a matter of fact, and I don't mean to be beating up on Erdogan, except he's someone whom I need to beat up on, particularly in this context. Part of what connected him to Gulen early on, as I said, was that Gulen saw in him someone who is a pious Muslim, but also understood the importance of democracy. And it turns out that Erdogan is neither. It's not only that he's non-democratic, but he's not pious. He is pretentious about pretending to be pious. He will pray in public, so he is seen to be a pious Muslim, which is actually not what you're supposed to do. You don't show it off. That's a form of what is called shirk. It's a kind of tertiary, not good thing, something you shouldn't be doing. And that's what he does. So anyway, when you read about his background and his family and his mother and his father and his grandmother and his grandparents, grandmothers and grandfathers, you're not really surprised he sort of came by honestly. The one impious thing that he did is his parents were desperate that he get married. And by the time he was closing in on 30, it's like, last chance, we've got her. She's a beautiful, pious woman. And he felt that for what he needed to do, he felt a calling to be doing what he was doing. He couldn't be an effective mate or an effective parent because he was so focused on what he was doing. So of course, his family became all of these endless array of kids and grown-ups and everyone in between who are inspired by him and drawn to him. And I think his parents accepted that as they saw him developing. So the first part of my book is a biography, briefly though. I don't belabor it. And the second part is again a kind of intellectual biography of what he thinks about, what he's written about. Only in this case, I was adding to what I had read by him, the fact that I had met him and had conversations with him a few times. So I was able to fill in certain things which perhaps I would not otherwise have been able to do. And then the third part, in terms of the space, the most substantial, is these interviews, and they were very simple. When or how or where did you first hear either about Gulen or Hizmet? What draws you to it? What criticisms do you have of it? A handful of questions. The interviews were conducted in English, French, German, and Turkish. I did not conduct the ones in Turkish myself. I had help on those. And then there was a whole bevy of people whom I was able to acknowledge because, like, the editor at the publisher's house would not allow me to acknowledge him. And that was true of the previous book, true of this book. So that's symptomatic of people who are involved with Gulen. They refused to be acknowledged. But I was permitted to acknowledge all the people who had helped by transcribing all the interviews. And the process of producing them was interesting in two different ways. At first, I simply, when I handed in the first version of the manuscript, all the interviews were pretty much as they had been, and I left in a lot of syntax and grammar and things that were a little bit less felicitous than they might have been, because I felt you want to feel how it sounded. But then my editor said, but it doesn't work well enough. You really need to edit them down, get rid of some of the extraneous stuff, and clean it up, which I was happy to do. We're ready to publish. No. Then it turns out that a good, probably dozen of the interviewees by that time were scared to have their names in a book such as this because of what was going on with Erdogan. So I said, we can use pseudonyms. And in the book, I write that I've had to do that because I want people to understand. My motive for writing this book is twofold. I'm interested in people understanding about who Fethullah Gulen is, what he's about, and I'm interested in people understanding what he's up against and what we're up against in a figure like Mr. Erdogan. So most of those people were willing to end up in the book under pseudonyms, but there were a handful that even then were too fearful. So there are actually fewer interviews in the book than there were recorded. Three more things. One, what the Hizmet movement is about, based both on what I've read and what I've seen, and not only in my interviews or my discussions, not interviews, my discussions with Fethullah Gulen himself and now the interviews with all those people, is, as I said, it's about service. And the service comes in a handful of different flavors. The most obvious is education. And by the way, one of Turkey's great tragedies under Erdogan is the first thing that he managed to do in trying to get to Hizmet was to close down all of the schools that had been founded by Hizmet, because he would prefer, obviously, to have an uneducated population out in the sticks that will simply take what he says because they have no basis for trying to understand, because they're uneducated. And of course, he's tried to do that all over the planet because Hizmet was represented in about 180 countries. I think there are probably a few fewer now because of Erdogan's ability either to bribe or to bully any number of places where Hizmet has been engaged. And the schools, when I talk about Hizmet schools, what am I talking about? And I have visited from kindergarten to the International Black Sea University in Tbilisi, Georgia, which is Hizmet founded. So that's the university where I've been teaching for a week every summer except for COVID in the last 5 or 6 summers. So I've seen very much in action schools from stem to stern with respect to the ages. And the three things perhaps, that stand out to me are two general and one particular. General, they cover everything from sports to art to literature to science to math, everything. The one topic they don't teach is religion. So they don't want religion to be an issue, much less are they preaching Islam. They're not teaching religion at all. One of my friends in the Hizmet movement who is Albanian, grew up in Albania in a very secular family. And he went to Hizmet schools. He became a much more observant Muslim because he was inspired by his teachers. But he was inspired. No one pushed him. No one even tried to tempt him. It was simply that that's what he came to. And not everyone necessarily comes to that. So I was impressed, I have been impressed by the curricula as I've seen them from place to place, the level at which the kids in the second grade were doing art, this was a Hizmet school also in Tbilisi, Georgia, that I visited not that long ago, just blew me away, that sort of thing. And that everything is covered, including sports, because Gulen's sense is the whole person. It's got to be physical and mental and emotional and psychological and spiritual. It all sort of, we're one package, and so you've got to attend to all the aspects of that package. The second thing, I guess I already said it, is that the one thing that isn't being taught is religion, which gives the lie to what my friend, for example, from Georgetown, the secularist, the secular Turk, felt or feared that, Hizmet is descending, Gulen is descending on people with, hardcore Islam. No, not at all, not at all. The more specific moment that blew me away was a school that I visited in Sydney, Australia, when I was there doing some talks. And the 12th graders had a project. The school had space outside, and they had a garden, and they were growing organic vegetables, which are not easy to find in the grocery stores in that part. It's a suburb of Sydney. So the three aspects of this process for them, and the teachers just give a little bit of guidance, but they're on their own. First of all, how do you grow vegetables? Now I have a different understanding of how the vegetables on my plate got there. I just thought, oh, mommy picks it up at the supermarket. Well, no, a farmer had to plant the seeds and had to tend them and had to worry about the weather and had to figure out what's going to happen if it's not raining enough or it's raining too much. That whole process that eventually brings the food to my plate is something that wouldn't have been in my head. And I'm providing a kind of service, secondly, to the community because they can't get organic vegetables. So everyone in that community around the school was thrilled to be purchasing vegetables from these kids. The third thing, this is the zinger. So what were they doing with the money that they were earning from this project? They were sending it to Africa, to a community that they had found where they had problems with clean water, and they needed a well dug, and they needed pipes that would get them water, so they were providing that. So every step of the way, it's what they're learning about how the world works, and it's about serving others. So the education system, and needless to say, the kind of programs that are sponsored, that are interfaith, from discussions to meals. Of course, iftar has become more and more popular, certainly in Washington, but across the country, which become an opportunity for interfaith dialogue and social programs, programs that involve youth, programs that involve arts, programs that involve sciences. I mean, it's endless. It is about trying to serve others because that's ultimately how the world is going to be improved. And one of the words that Gulen uses again and again is altruism. You have to learn to be more altruistic. You have to be doing things for others, not because of what you figure is going to end up benefiting you. You just have to do things for others because you should be doing things for others. As a pious Muslim, he says, if I love God, how can I not love all of humanity that as a pious Muslim I understand God made and God loves? So I can't love God, I can't claim to be a pious Muslim and not love others just because they don't happen to be Muslim or just don't happen to be the kind of Muslim that I am. And that is expressed in everything that he stands for, that he teaches, preaches, that he writes about and lectures about, and that is carried out by people all over the world who are inspired by him to do so. There was one other thing that I wanted to do, which was to read you a couple of passages from two different interviews. I mean, it was like, which interviews do I choose? And I thought of two just almost off, arbitrarily. One of them is, where are you, George? George Donikian. If you're familiar with how names work, you'll recognize that his surname is Armenian. Whom I met in Australia. I'm from Donikian Media, so that's what he does. He is a media man. In essence, I've been a supporter of the Australian Intercultural Society for the better part of the last half a dozen years. This is where I first discovered the influence of Hizmet. And for me, I understood very early on that it was a marvelous initiative sourced originally out of Turkey by a man called Hoca Efendi, Fethullah Gulen. In essence, what Gulen was asking, not so much his disciples, but his supporters to do, was to reach out, travel the world, and educate as many people as possible so that those one-time dark spots would have less room to grow. And he goes on talking about this at some length. He talks about Hizmet schools, its programs, its international festival of language and culture. And then what grabbed me, and you'll see why in a second, is the next thing he talked about. His father had passed away just a year or two before I met him. My father left Europe at the end of World War II and came to the other end of the globe, where few spoke his language, much less understood his culture. He spoke actually several languages, but in essence, when he arrived in Australia, he was Greek, Armenian, Turk. Now, if you're familiar with history, particularly of, let's say, the last 500 or the last 200 or the last 100 years, you don't usually find in a peaceable context the words Greek, Armenian, Turk in the same turn of phrase. His Turkish, as Ahmed, who was my guide, the guy who was with me, who was taking me around to the various people whom I interviewed when I was there in Sydney and Melbourne, as Ahmed would tell you, his Turkish was very good. We lost him, it was just a couple of weeks ago. I was thinking it was about a year earlier. It was just a few weeks before. But Dad was someone who believed that if you aspire and you want to give up your best, and you keep driving yourself in that direction, then ultimately you will keep the goals and reach the marks that you have set for yourself. He was delighted when I said I wanted to support this group of guys who were involved in this thing called Hizmet. He said, tell me about it. And I told him about Hizmet and Hoca Efendi. My father said, if you want to support them, get behind them. Don't do it half-heartedly, do it to the best of your ability. And when he first met the boys from Sydney College, he was immersed in a trice. This is his father, right? And he reached back and started speaking the Turkish. I remember he used to speak with a great many of his good, close friends in the early days in Sydney. And they couldn't believe that a man of Greek, Armenian background could be so open to them. I said, well, because he's not just Armenian, not just Greek, but he is Turkish too. And then he goes on. And the point for me, of course, is this was a case in point. George's father was exactly the kind of being that fits the Hizmet mold, because his identity is contrived of different cultures, different languages, different religions, different senses of self that comfortably coincide within him. And the vision of Fethullah Gulen is of a world that works like that. So aside from for George and for his father, I'm sad that his father passed. I'm sad that he couldn't have been younger and still around to become more and more involved as I think he would have, but his son is very involved. And the other, again, almost arbitrarily, is a character I interviewed in Brooklyn. His name is Leonard Petlach. I was born in the Soviet Union, in Minsk, in 1971. In 1986, we moved to New York, to Brooklyn. I went to college and grad school and back to grad school again, which is its own strange story. I'm the executive director of the Kings Bay YWHA in Brooklyn. So an American institution, as most of you, but perhaps not all of you are aware, that was created, I want to say in the late 19th century, was called the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association. So it was an entity that provided a place for athletics and for socializing and, to a certain extent, culturizing and all that sort of stuff. And at a certain point in the late 20th century, 1950s, post-Holocaust, Jewish Americans who were not necessarily inclusable within the YMCA, and then its female equivalent, the YWCA, Young Women's Christian Association, created a Jewish equivalent. So that's what the YMHA is, the Young Men's Hebrew Association, and in this case, the organization of which he is executive director is Men and Women, okay? So that's context. So this is where he's coming from, who came, obviously Jewish, from a Soviet Union, which of course permitted no practice of religion whatsoever. So it's not as if he arrived here with that as a kind of interest. So I think the first time I got acquainted with the Hizmet movement was in the context of the flotilla incident in 2010. that was Gaza, and that was Israel, and it was the Turkish boats coming to break the Israeli blockade to bring stuff to Gaza. And the interesting thing about that, as a parenthesis, is, one, Erdogan said, look, I don't know anything about it. It took about a year for it to emerge that, in fact, he had put the whole thing in motion because he was looking for an excuse to worsen the relationship between Israel and Turkey. But the other interesting thing about it was that Gulen was one of the people who very quickly spoke out, and not perhaps the way he was expected to. He said the Israelis have a right to be protecting their border, and if this was a ship that was not bringing what it said it was bringing, or these were boats, whatever, that's what he's talking about. So this is why, and this is when Leonard Petlach would have first heard about Hizmet. Right after that, they started their first Turkish cultural center in our neighborhood, and that's when I was introduced to them by one of my elected officials, an assemblyman from Brooklyn. I've read pretty much everything available in English on Hizmet and Fethullah Gulen, and I've become very close friends with some of the Hizmet people. I've traveled to Turkey a number of times with them. I've brought twice, I think, some leaders of the Hizmet movement to Israel, which was really one of the most unusual experiences because a lot of Israelis would not really expect a group of Muslims, religious Muslims, to travel through Israel learning and meeting with people. So that was really an incredible experience. And I'm really privileged to be part of a group of non-Muslim members of the Hizmet movement, and he goes on from there. These are just two among, obviously, many individuals who reflect what you heard. The questions I asked were very neutral. So I was not setting anyone up to give me the answers I wanted or the answers that I expected, but the consistency of the answers was nothing less than astonishing. Criticisms, hard to come by. There were, here and there, not enough women in the front, too much in the back. But I already knew that because, again, in order to interview some of the people I interviewed and also in general to help me think about this book, I went for a few days to a Hizmet retreat on the coast of Maryland. I forget which, what do you call it? Which of those towns that people always go to?
Ocean City.
Thank you, Ocean City, in the winter. And one of the groups that I met with when I was there was all kids. They ranged from 18 to 30, and about 15 of them. And of the maybe 12 or 13 of them, I think 10 of them were women, young women, and they were already on top of that issue. And I thought to myself, boy, this is going to change, because they're going to be in charge in a few years. And that sense of unevenness, of course, that kind of unevenness couldn't possibly happen in this country where, how many female presidents have we had so far? I've lost track, we've had so many. Lock them up. Anyway, so there were little comments of that sort that came here and there, but generally speaking, the perspectives were so consistent that I was astonished.